It's not a proof of the impossibility of determinism, but it is a proof of the impossibility or the high implausibility of physical determinism, that is, of determinism solely by physical events. So I begin with some definitions. Although physical events are often defined in terms of events involving predicates belonging to a true and complete physics, or one supervenient thereon, this is not a very helpful definition, since we do not know much about what a future true and complete physics would be like. But there is surely one property which all the events with which a future physics would be concerned would have, and that is the property of being publicly accessible events. So I shall define a physical event, as on your handout, as an event to which no one person has privileged access. By experience, I should add. And if I can show that the causal closure of the physical is implausible on this definition of physical events, it will surely be implausible on any other currently available definition. I shall contrast a physical event with a mental event, defined as one to which its subject, the person whose it is, necessarily has privileged event access by experiencing it. And I shall define a pure mental event as a mental event which does not entail the occurrence of a physical event. By a person having privileged access to some event, I mean that necessarily he or she is in a better position than anyone else to know that it is occurring. Whatever ways others have of finding out whether or not it is occurring, the subject can also use, but the subject has an additional way by experiencing it. Among physical events are brain events. Anyone who learns how to use the relevant apparatus can find out about as much about my brain events as I can, or as can anyone else. Perceptions, such as me seeing a tree, are mental events, on the other hand, since whatever ways others can use to discover whether or not I am seeing a tree, such as observing my behavior and studying my brain, I could also use. I could watch a film of my behavior and study the brain events just as well as could anyone else. But I have an additional way of knowing about my perception, that is, by actually doing the perceiving, actually experiencing seeing the tree. Perceptions are, however, not pure mental events on my definition, since seeing a tree entails that there is a tree present, and that's a physical event. But me seeming to see a tree, that is, me believing that I'm seeing a tree, does not entail the existence of the tree, and so that's a pure mental event. The class of pure mental events includes all conscious events, that is, apparent experiences, events of such kind that they occur only insofar as we are aware that they are occurring. Conscious events include sensations such as pains and feelings of nausea and patterns of colour in my visual field. They also include occurrent thoughts which crossed my mind, such as, today is Friday. If I am not in any way aware that I'm having a pain, or having the thought that today is Friday, I'm not in pain, and the thought isn't crossing my mind. Pure mental events also include apparent perceptions, such as my apparent perception of a tree, apparent awareness of one's beliefs and desires, and also apparent awareness of truths of reason, such as being conscious of 23 threes are 69, as I think about it. Also, among conscious events are intentions. By my intention, I mean what I'm trying to do, my purpose which I am trying to fulfill. Intentions include short-term intentions, such as intentions to move an arm or utter a sentence, medium-term intentions, such as walking to the railway station or eating lunch, which are purposes that I am trying to fulfill during the whole of a longer period, and also long-term intentions, such as intentions to write a book or pursue some career, which I try to fulfill by actions at different periods over a long stretch of time. If my body performs some movement of a kind which I normally make intentionally, but which on this occasion was simply an unintended reflex, then there was no intention in what I was doing. With respect to intentions, as with respect to other pure mental events, other people can reach well-justified conclusions about whether I had some intention in making some movement and what that intention was. They can reach those conclusions from a study of my public behavior, including what I say, and perhaps one day from a study of my brain. Yet whatever ways others use to find out about my intentions, I could also use. I could watch a film of my behavior and study my brain just as well as could anyone else. But I have an additional way, not available to anyone else, of knowing whether I had some intention and what that intention was, by actually experiencing the intention. And necessarily, no one else can experience my intention, for a person who experiences an intention is a person who has the intention. Pure mental events include, as well as conscious events, what I call continuing mental states, that is, events such as beliefs and desires, which may occur while the subject is not conscious of them, but of which he or she can become conscious by asking herself what she believes or desires, or by being aware of them when she is planning to take them into account in her actions. They are pure mental events because while the subject can use all the ways available to others for discovering what she believes or desires, she has a way of discovering these states which is not available to others. Okay, so that is my definitions of terms. Now, our ordinary experience of life seems to show us very strongly that our intentions often cause our bodily movements. Consider first an intention which may or may not succeed in producing the intended effect. For example, suppose that I am trying to lift a weight. I may not succeed in lifting the weight, but if I do succeed, it seems to me strongly that it was me trying, that is my intention, which caused the weight to rise, and so that lifting the weight was an intentional action. It seems to me strongly that this is so. To try to do something just is to do what one believes will make more likely the occurrence of what I'm trying to do. Clearly the weight will not rise unless I try to raise it. The harder I try, the higher it will raise. So it seems very strongly that to me, as I try and lift a weight, that my intention is causing it. I, through my intention, that is to say, is causing it. There is a continuum of actions between actions like this, in which I have to try for a short time in order to produce the intended effect, and those bodily actions which are so easy for most of us to perform and take so short a time that we are seldom aware of a time when we are trying to bring about the effect and have not yet succeeded in doing so. But clearly there is a difference between me intentionally raising my arm and my arm just rising in a way unintended by me. That difference seems to me to consist in me intentionally moving my arm, which consists in me having the intention to move the arm, causing the movement of the arm. So that's the way it seems to us. It is a fundamental epistemic principle, which I call the principle of credulity. It's being called by other people sometimes phenomenal conservatism or epistemic conservatism. It's a fundamental epistemic principle that what we seem to, that is what we apparently experience, is probably so, and hence we are justified in believing, that is, it's rational for us to believe, that it is probably so, barring counter-evidence, barring defeaters. If it seems to me that I'm seeing a tree, then probably I am seeing a tree. If it seems to me that I'm hearing you speak, then probably I am hearing you speak. All this in the absence of evidence that I am subject to some illusion. If we could not rely on our apparent experience of the world in this way, even perhaps after we'd checked it by looking again or listening for a longer period, then we could have no knowledge of the world at all. So, since our experience seems to tell us so strongly that our intentions cause our bodily movements, it is, in the absence of counter-evidence, very probable that they do. Science has shown us that all our bodily movements are caused more directly by brain events, initiating the sequences of events in our nerves which cause the bodily movements. So, it is very probable that our intentions cause the bodily movements by causing the brain events which cause those bodily movements, and so that our mental events often cause physical events. So much for apparent experience. But the doctrine of, quote, the causal closure of the physical, which I'll summarize by CCP, this doctrine is the doctrine that physical events are caused only by physical events. It follows from CCP that such common sense views as that I came to this building because I had the intention to do so, and so the intention caused my leg movements which brought me here, are false. Now, it is logically possible that such common sense beliefs are simply illusions, but given my previous argument, it would need substantial evidence, that is, substantial counter-evidence to what strongly seems to be the case, to show that they are illusions, and so that CCP is probably true. CCP is an empirical doctrine about which kinds of events cause which other kinds of events, and so a justified belief in CCP requires a justified belief in some scientific theory which entails it. In this paper, I argue that the epistemological thesis that no one could ever be justified in believing any theory which entails CCP, and that the claims of recent neuroscientific work to produce that justification are not merely false, but couldn't possibly be true because of what constitutes a justified belief in a scientific theory. For a justified belief in a scientific theory requires a justified belief that it makes successful predictions. And that means both a justified belief that it predicts certain events and also a justified belief that those events occurred. In this paper, I will be arguing that at least one of those two justified beliefs, the justified belief that the theory predicts certain events and the justified belief that the events occurred, I will be arguing that at least one of those justified beliefs couldn't be had if CCP were true. Hence, CCP is, in a crucial sense, self-defeating. If it were true, we couldn't be justified in believing it. So, how can anyone have a justified belief that some scientific theory predicts certain events? Scientists in the relevant field will have calculated that it makes these predictions. And if a scientist can hold all the calculations in her mind at one time, it will be for her a deliverance of reason, evident a priori, that the theory does make those predictions. Alas, for any scientific theory of any complexity, most experts in the field will be unable to hold in their minds at one time all the relevant calculations. Even as a scientist reads through the text of her calculations, she depends on her memory towards the end of the calculation for her belief that the initial calculations were correct. Later in life, all that she may remember is that it did seem to her at an earlier time that the theory made those predictions. She may have a diary in which she recorded this, which will be, as it were, her testimony about this to herself and others. Non-scientists, and scientists less central in the field, will depend on the testimony of those whom they regard as experts, that they have made these calculations. So, what makes someone's belief that the theory predicts certain events a justified belief is, if it can be had, experience of oneself currently seeing that the calculations are correct, or memory of having made such calculations in the past, or testimony from oneself or others that they had made certain calculations. Or rather, since all of these sources may mislead, It is apparent experience, apparent memory, and apparent testimony which provide our justified belief that the theory makes true predictions, justified in the absence of counter-evidence, often called defeaters. And how can anyone have a justified belief that the events predicted in fact occurred? They will normally depend on the evidence of the same three sources. Certain observers will apparently, in a wide sense, experience these events. That is, if they are physical events, they will perceive them, or if they are conscious events, they will experience them in a narrow sense. Later, the observers may apparently remember having experienced the events, and others will depend on the apparent testimony of observers about these events, or the observers may depend on their own apparent written testimony to themselves. Alternatively, a believer may have a justified belief that the events predicted occurred because it's a consequence, deductive or probabilistic, of some other justifiably believed theory that they did. But in that case, a justified belief in that other theory would itself depend on the evidence of the same three sources. When we believe that our apparent experience is a real experience, as by the principle of credulity we are normally justified in doing in the absence of counter-evidence, we believe them because we believe that they are caused by the events apparently experienced. You believe that your apparent experience of observing some distant star through a telescope is a real experience, and so that there's really a star there, because you believe that your apparent experience was caused by the star emitting light which impinged on your eyes and caused the apparent experience of it. If you came to believe that your apparent experience was caused by a malfunctioning of the telescope and had no other reason for believing that the star was there, you would cease to believe that the star was there. So, if your apparent experience is a real experience, then a physical event is causing a mental event, and that, of course, is not ruled out by CCP. Our apparent memories of our experiences are themselves apparent experiences of our past experiences, and so again, by the principle of credulity, we are justified in believing that those experiences, past experiences, occurred in the absence of counter-evidence. When we believe that, we believe that those past experiences occurred because when we believe our apparent memories, that is, our memories of our past experiences, we believe our memories because we believe that those memories are caused by the past experiences. In the case of memories of experiences less than a few minutes earlier, it may be that the past experience causes the present memory of it directly, that is, without causing it by causing some other event which causes the memory. But we know well, and neuroscience has also shown us, that in the case of memories of events more than a few minutes ago, the causation is indirect. That is, the past experience causes a brain event, a trace in the brain, which later causes the memory of it. And so, our reliance on apparent memory for our knowledge of past events depends on assuming that a mental event, a past experience, causes a physical event, a brain event, which in turn causes our memory. It also follows from the principle of credulity that when it seems to us that someone is telling us something, orally or in writing, we are justified in believing that they are telling us that thing, in the absence of counter-evidence. We assume that their intention to tell us what they apparently remember has caused the words reporting the experience to come out of their mouth or to be typed into their computer. If we came to believe that the words which came out of someone's mouth came out of their mouth because they suffer from fluid aphasia, that is, a disease which produces streams of unintended words to come out of someone's mouth, if we came to believe that the words coming out of some person's mouth came out of them for that reason, just unintendedly, or that that person's fingers pressing keys on the computer keyboard were caused by a neuroscientist controlling the neural impulses to their fingers, we would no longer believe that testimony. The apparent testimony would not be real testimony. We believe apparent testimony because we believe that the testifier had formed the intention that the words should come out of their mouth, and that intention has caused the words to come out of their mouth. And when we also believe someone's apparent testimony to have experienced some event in the past, we assume that their past experience has caused their apparent memory of it, again, a mental to physical causation. And so, in relying on apparent testimony to a past event, involves relying on two separate processes of mental to physical causing. Causing in the sense of the cause being a necessary part of the total cause of the physical event. So, in relying on apparent memory, one's own apparent memory of events longer than a few minutes ago, we are relying on the occurrence of a mental to physical event, and in relying on someone's testimony to their experience of some past event, we are relying on two processes of mental to physical causation, one in them and one in them causing their present memory, and one in them causing the words to come out of their mouth. A scientist takes his apparent observations, experiences, and calculations as probably correct, at least when he's looked carefully and checked, in the absence of contrary evidence. Almost all scientific knowledge relies on apparent memory, for example, of the results of experiments or calculations only written up the following day. And for all science, we rely most of the time on the apparent testimony, written and spoken, of observers to have made certain observations or had certain experiences, and of theoreticians to have done certain calculations. And the wider public relies entirely on the apparent testimony of scientists, both with regard to their calculations and to their observations. A solitary scientist would be justified in believing his apparent perceptions while he was actually perceiving them, without assuming that there was any mental to physical causation. But no one would be justified in believing a large-scale scientific theory without having a lot of evidence about the occurrence of events at different times and places, and having his calculations confirmed by other scientists. And so it would seem that we cannot have any significant justification for believing in any scientific theory without relying on apparent memory and apparent testimony, and so without relying on processes which consist in mental events causing physical events. Hence it would seem that no one would ever be justified in believing CCP, since the justification would consist in believing in the occurrence of processes which would be ruled out by CCP itself. Nevertheless, scientists have attempted to establish CCP, and there are two different ways in which they have attempted to do this, or at any rate could attempt to do this. And the first way is to attempt to show that it never makes any difference to the pattern of later physical events whether some mental events occurs. And the obvious way to set about this would be to show that the most plausible candidate for mental events which make such a difference, that is, our intentions, never do make any difference to our brain events. And this, as many of you will know, is what a recent neuroscientific research program has sought to do. A program initiated by the work of Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. These results have been interpreted by many scientists as showing that conscious events, and so mental events generally, in my sense, never cause brain events. And in the original and most influential Libet experiments, subjects were instructed to move their hand at a moment of their choice within a short specified period, for example, a period of 20 seconds. The subjects watched a very fast clock and subsequently reported the exact time at which they formed their intention to move their hand. They reported the intention to move their hand as occurring, on average, 200 milliseconds before the time at which the experimenters recorded the onset of activity in the subject's muscles initiating the hand movement. This is, I think, on your handout if you haven't followed the details. Experiments of other kinds, Libet claimed, showed that subjects report the time of sensations as occurring 50 milliseconds before the time of the brain events which caused them. That led Libet to hold that subjects misjudged the time of all conscious events by 50 milliseconds, and so he concluded that their intention occurred on average 150 milliseconds before the muscle activation. However, electrodes placed on subject scalps recorded, on each occasion of hand moving, a build-up of electric potential called the readiness potential, RP, which was presumably caused by the occurrence of a particular kind of brain event which occurred on average 550 milliseconds before the muscle activity, and so 400 milliseconds before the occurrence of the intention. The last 30 years have seen very considerable progress in understanding the neural basis of intentional actions, made possible by new techniques which allow neuroscientists to identify far more precisely than by measurements of electric potential on the scalp, far more precisely which areas of the brain are active some exact number of milliseconds before the time at which subjects claim they form some intention. And the results of this work do seem initially to give very considerable support to the view that a prior brain event of the kind which gives rise to RP is a necessary condition, though not necessarily a sufficient condition, is a necessary condition for the occurrence of a simple intentional bodily movement of the kind studied by Libet. So, if the subject's reports are at all accurate, there is this succession of events, and that is shown on the diagram at the end of your handout. This succession of events: a brain event, B1, followed by a conscious event, the intention represented by M1 in the diagram on the handout, and also followed by other brain events represented by B2 and B3, and then later than M1, a brain event represented by B4, which directly causes the muscle activity and so the movement. And many neuroscientists have argued from this kind of evidence to reach the extraordinary conclusion that the attention does not cause the movement. One group of neuroscientists, for example, concluded from Libet's data that Libet's data, I quote, this is a quotation, contradict the naive view of free will that conscious intention causes action. Clearly, conscious intention cannot cause an action if a neural event precedes and correlates with the action, that precedes and correlates with the action comes before the intention, conscious intention. That is, these scientists argued that because there was an event, RP, which correlated with the bodily movement, M1 couldn't have anything to do with it. But of course, that doesn't follow at all, because B1 might cause RP, and B1 might cause M1, and M1 might cause the bodily movement. So this particular conclusion was clearly false. But nevertheless, and the most natural explanation of the data would obviously be that B1, which also caused RP, caused M1 the intention, and the intention caused the bodily movement. To show that the intention was not also a necessary part of the cause, you would need to show that an earlier event, B1, causes the very same sequence of brain events with or without subjects having the requisite intention to produce that bodily movement. And the Libet program is nowhere near ever attempting to show that. But the major problem with Libet-type experiments is the one to which I drew attention earlier, that in order to show that or anything else, this program depends on the apparent testimony of subjects for information about the time of the occurrence of their mental events. And so all Libet-type experiments designed to show that mental events do not cause physical events require the experimenter to assume that sometimes mental events do cause physical events. Such experiments might serve to show that certain kinds of bodily movement, for example those studied in Libet-type experiments, which we might have regarded as formed by our intentions, are in fact not formed by our intentions, but they could only show that if we assume that other bodily movements, such as the movements of our lips in reporting our intentions, are formed by those intentions. Clearly, the same general objection applies to any attempt to establish CCP which relies on evidence about which mental events occur when. We could only get enough evidence to show the theory to be true by relying on the apparent testimony of other people, and that involves assuming that the theory is false. That's one way of attempting to show CCP. Try and show that when mental events occur, they don't make any difference to brain events. But of course, for the reasons given, that would be self-defeating. But there is a second way by which it might seem that scientists could establish CCP, and that is on the basis of evidence merely about which physical events occur when, without relying on any evidence about which mental events occur when. Could not observation merely of physical events provide us with a justified belief in some very general deterministic physical theory, from which it follows that every physical event has another physical event as an immediately prior, necessary and sufficient cause? If this could be shown, it would follow that no brain event could have a mental event as a necessary part of its cause. For if a deterministic physical theory of this kind were true, the physical event would have occurred anyway. Whatever mental events the subject had could have made no difference to the brain events. Suppose that scientists discover that for each physical event F, studied in large samples of many different kinds of physical events, including apparent intentional bodily movements, there is some other immediately prior physical event E, which a certain deterministic theory claims will have F as its immediate effect. That would seem powerful evidence in favour of that theory, and so in favour of CCP. The problem, however, remains that our evidence about which physical events occur when in these last samples of events must itself come from the reports of scientists about the results of their experiments, that is, from the apparent testimonies and memories of scientists about what they claim to have perceived. But we've seen that we are only justified in relying on apparent memory and testimony if we are justified in assuming that past observations cause brain events which cause present memories, and that people's intentions cause words to come out of their mouths. So again, relying on the evidence of the apparent memory and testimony of scientists about what they have observed already seems to presuppose the falsity of CCP. However, it is possible to avoid this objection in the case of the second way of attempting to prove CCP, by modifying our understanding of memory and our understanding of testimony in such a way that we could be said to remember some past physical event without assuming that the memory involves remembering a past experience of that event, and that we would be said to give testimony to the occurrence of a past event without assuming that that involves testifying to a past experience of that event. We could, for example, understand memory simply as memory of the occurrence of events, and not only of events which are experiences of the occurrence of events. A subject could be said to remember some past physical event in virtue of those events causing traces in his brain, which at a later time cause the apparent memory of those events, without any mental to physical causation being involved. The memory traces caused in a person's brain by the occurrence of some event do sometimes cause that person to become aware later of details of that event of which they were not at the time aware. And so it does seem a not too unnatural use of the word remember to say that they remembered those details. So you could be said to remember some event simply in virtue of the event having made some trace in your brain, which you were perhaps not aware of at the time, but nevertheless later threw up some apparent memory of it, not of your experience of it, and that would be enough to show that the physical event occurred on that stretched understanding of memory. That does not seem too unnatural a use of the word remember. And in that case, the only assumption involved would be that a past event caused a present belief that it happened, and that does not involve any mental to physical causation. And we could stretch our understanding of testimony a lot. We could come to understand testimony to amount to merely the public utterance of sentences reporting that an event occurred, that utterance being caused by a chain of events in the utterer, itself caused by the event reported, a chain which need not include any conscious events. In that case, the testimony would not be testimony that the testifier had observed the events, but merely testimony that the events had occurred. Thus, someone's eyes could receive light rays from physical events, and because those physical events caused brain events in that person, the person could subsequently report them without that causal chain proceeding through any conscious events at all, through the person being consciously aware of them at all. The words would merely come out of his mouth. He wouldn't be, not because he intended them, but because some brain event caused them to come out of his mouth, a brain event being caused by the events apparently testified to. So, in that way, we could really stretch our understanding of memory and testimony to get away from the problem that scientists seem to need memory and testimony of a rather stronger and more natural kind in order to be justified in holding their theories. And that would involve mental to physical causation. However, even if you do stretch your understanding of memory and testimony in these ways, that will give you perhaps a route whereby scientists can come to learn and other people can come to learn about the occurrence of certain physical events which are in fact predicted by a physical theory. But there is a further, and to my mind, insuperable difficulty in supposing that we could ever have a justified belief that some deterministic physical theory gave true predictions about the relations between physical events. And that is that we would also need not merely a justified belief that certain relations between physical events occurred, but also a justified belief that these relations were predicted by that deterministic theory. Remember, you need two sorts of beliefs in order to believe a theory. You need to believe that certain physical events occurred, and you need to believe that that theory predicts those physical events. And it's the second one that causes the, to my mind, insuperable difficulty for CCP. Anyone who had not calculated for himself what that theory predicted about the relations between physical events must depend on the evidence provided by the apparent testimony of scientists to have calculated this, and their testimony that they had seen, that is, had a conscious belief that that was what the theory predicted. That is, they would need evidence of the conscious events of scientists, not merely that the physical events occurred, but that the scientists had seen that the theory predicted those events, and that would be evidence of their conscious events. But if the deterministic physical theory were true, the scientists could not have been caused to give that testimony by their intention to tell what they believed about what the theory predicted, because that would be mental to physical causation. And likewise, for the same reason, no scientist could rely on his own testimony to himself, recorded in a diary, that he had previously calculated the consequences of the deterministic theory. And a scientist could himself not rely on his own apparent memory of having calculated these consequences, for again, that would involve his past experience of his calculations causing the brain event which caused his memory. Only if a scientist could hold in his mind at one time all his calculations, from which it apparently followed that the deterministic theory predicted certain events, could he have a justified belief that the theory made successful predictions, and so a justified belief in CCP. For most scientific theories and most scientists, this is most unlikely. The crucial difference between having a justified belief that certain physical events occurred and having a justified belief that a certain theory predicted those events is that for the latter, we need evidence not merely of the occurrence of physical events, we need evidence of the occurrence of conscious events, that is, of we or someone else seeing that certain calculations are true. And to have that evidence, we or they must rely on some process of a past experience causing a present memory of that past experience, which would be by causing a brain state which caused the present memory, or of the scientist reporting his calculations, which we could understand only if we assume that his intention to report those calculations caused the words to come out of his mouth. So I started with some definitions. I started with a general suggestion, the principle of credulity, that we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be in the absence of counter-evidence. Seems to me to be the case that our intentions cause our bodily movements, and so that CCP must be false. But perhaps that's only in the absence of counter-evidence, and could there be counter-evidence? I produced a general argument that there couldn't be counter-evidence because all evidence depended on apparent experience, memory, and testimony, and that involved depending on causal processes which involved mental events causing physical events. And then I went on to consider two ways in which scientists have or could attempt to prove their conclusion. The first way was by showing that certain physical processes occurred, and that the same processes would occur without the occurrence of a mental event. And that an example of that was Libet-type experiments. But I showed that's obviously going to fail because you couldn't learn about the occurrence of the mental event without relying on the processes which would violate the CCP. But then I went on to suggest that, well, couldn't we learn about what happens in the physical world without relying on any knowledge of the mental events? And superficially, no, because we would rely on scientists' memory and testimony to those events in order to know about them. But I suggested perhaps we might stretch the words memory, our understanding of memory and testimony, in such a way that we could have memory of a past event, physical event, without that process proceeding through, without there being any mental to physical causation in our acquisition of the memory, and likewise with testimony. But I said that even if we do this, to my mind, somewhat illegitimate move, nevertheless, the theory itself could only be established if it could be established that the theory had predicted these particular events. And we can only know about that if we rely on the conscious events, not merely the physical events, but the conscious events of scientists causing our knowledge of it. And that does involve violation of CCP. So CCP could never be established. That is my thesis.